If you're new to the game of Magic the Gathering and the format of Commander, making your own deck can be quite daunting. You have to come up with 100 cards to run, but where do you even start? You might have picked out your Commander, but now you're 1 down and 99 to go. Hi, I'm Harrison, I run these here parts. Here's what I hope helps. To start off, you need to understand that Commander is different than most formats. It's naturally slower and you'll feel this need to keep up with the rest of the table. That's easy enough when it's 1v1, but when you add 2 more people to the table, you need to start setting your deck up so it can succeed. That's how what I'd call the pillars of Commander are founded. They are the essential parts of Commander that you absolutely need to address with your deck. The first one is card advantage. Note how I said card advantage, not card draw. Not all card draw is card advantage, and not all card advantage is card draw. You have to make sure you're going up in cards. When it comes to card advantage, the more repeatable it is, the better. Take a look at a card like Beast Whisperer. If we're in green, we're naturally playing a bunch of creatures already. This card's going to let us draw a bunch of cards off of just playing our deck. Cards like this are super powerful because they're going to give us a lot of long-term value. And when you can have more than one of them on the board, it just goes wild. So you obviously can't run 2 Beast Whisperers in your deck, but when you run a card like Guardian Project, now we're up a card every time you play a creature. You want to make sure your hand stays full, because if you're able to keep your hand full, then you're able to have more options and more ways to play around with how your opponents are playing. Believe me, the worst feeling in Commander is to get to turn 3 or 4 and you're just playing whatever comes off the top and you have nothing else going on. Card advantage comes in all shapes and sizes, so you need to know what to prioritize. Personally, I like repeatable effects that we trigger. So like Beast Whisperer is at the top of the list. My next on that list would be repeatable effects that trigger themselves. So like Phyrexian Arena, instead of us doing something to draw a card, it just naturally happens every turn. The bottom of the tier list would be cards that just draw once and that's it. Now, I'm not saying don't run these cards at all, I'm just saying be a little more critical of them. If you're only gaining like a card or 2, it's not worth it. But sometimes cards like these, you might randomly draw 10 cards. Like, look at Rishkar's expertise. If we know we can consistently have a creature out there that's like a Gigantosaurus, then Rishkar's expertise becomes super appealing. This isn't in my script, but an additional part to card advantage and the other pillars that I'll touch on is additional value besides just card advantage. So Rishkar's expertise does something other than just drawing cards. You might want to look into that too and consider that, and that will make cards better. Despite my examples, blue is the best color for just raw card advantage. Green is not too far behind it. Black is behind these two, but ahead of red and white. Red and white have gotten a lot of support as of recently, but I still feel like it doesn't have the depth to it as the other colors. The next pillar you need to address is ramp. Ramp is any way we can put ourselves ahead in mana. There's a debate out there if the term ramp comes from rampant growth, because rampant growth, or if it's because you're ramping so hard that your mana just goes off in a stiff incline. Ramp is so important because, like, when you look at your deck, are you really jazzed up for all those 2 drops? You're just playing to slightly dindle before you get your other stuff out and maybe stop it so your opponents can't beat you up super early? Or are you really jazzed about that 8 drop that you're just going to slam on the table, wow everyone, and just take over a game? You're playing this for the 8 drop. So that's why we need to focus on ramp. Ramping also means when we get to the later game, we can play 2 or 3 spells that are all 3 or 4 mana. This often leads to just really big backbreaking turns. There are several ways to ramp. You have mana rocks, which are artifacts that produce mana. They're colorless, and if you're willing to spend a little bit more mana, you can often fix your mana with it by getting the colors that you need. Then there's mana dorks, which are creatures you can tap for mana. They're normally limited to just green, but there are other mana dorks in the other colors. The best and most efficient ones are definitely in green though. Mana rocks are better than mana dorks for several reasons. Mainly, a mana dork has summoning sickness. So I can't tap Llanowar Elves the turn it comes out, but I can tap Sol Ring the turn it comes out. People also run a lot more removal that deals with creatures than removal that deals with artifacts. So if player 1 has a board full of mana rocks and player 2 has a board full of mana dorks and someone blows up the board, one player is going to be fine, the other one isn't. In between rocks and dorks, we have these auras. They don't quite have a nickname like dorks and rocks. They're exclusively in green and usually make a single land produce more mana. While they can be useful, it is quite annoying when you get to a late game and, oh, which land was this aura attached to? I don't quite remember. It can be a headache. The next group of ramp cards would be cards like Rampant Growth. Just like mana dorks, they're most common in green, and the best ones are exclusive to green. These cards go search your library for a land and throw it into play. It is important to note that while Rampant Growth is ramp, Lay of the Land isn't. Note how that land is just going into your hand. You aren't going up in mana, you're just assuring that you have mana the next turn you need to play land. There's also this aspect of deck thinning, but that's too much of a complex subject, we'll get to it in a later video. It's important to note that people are a lot less likely to blow up lands. It's kind of a social faux pas to go after lands, so lands are usually safer than both artifacts and creatures. I think these are some of the best ramp cards you can be running in Commander. Just be prepared because there's a lot of searching your deck and then shuffling, and that can get annoying, that can take a lot of time. You might just not be into that. Then there are the additional land cards, the cards that say, hey, you can play an extra land, you can play 2 extra land. I'd put these cards rather low on my tier list. Sure, in a perfect world where you draw just what you need to make all of this work, it could be turn 10 and you have 20 lands. But what happens more often than not is you bottom out on lands in your hand, and 3 turns from now, you just don't have that additional land to play. So I only normally like these cards if I'm drawing a crap ton of cards, or I have access to the lands that are in my graveyard. Then there are some ramp cards that are slightly different than the ramp cards I've brought up so far. These are the discounters. Now, discounters are kind of rare. They don't print them too often. And then when they do, they're typically pretty specific. You're not typically going to see a discounter that says all of your spells cost 1 mana less. It's usually going to be like all of your enchantments cost 1 mana less. Now, it normally doesn't cover mana pips, so that's a little bit of a drawback. But when you get to the late game and you're wanting to play like 3 enchantments from your hand, this card is going to count for 3 mana, whereas a normal mana dork is only going to count for 1. Now, the very bottom of ramp for me are rituals. These are instants and sorceries that just add mana to your mana pool. That's it, they're out. Now, of course, there's an exception to every rule. There are a couple cards that I think are decent, like Jeska's Will. You know what? You can get some extra value in there. It can be good. Mana Geyser is downright broken in Commander, but for the most part, unless I'm getting just a ton of mana out of it, I don't think it's worth it. Now, when looking at ramp as a whole, the best color for ramping is green, and it's by a large margin. The good thing about this, though, is that ramp is so heavily involved with artifacts, and artifacts tend to be colorless, and they like to print cycles of artifacts that work with each color, so you're always going to have artifacts that will help you out. You can run a white, red, blue deck, and you will have a ton of artifacts available to you that will produce mana. The final pillar that you need to respect is removal. Removal is often seen as less important as the other two, but it's still really important. Do not overlook removal. Removal is just as it sounds, something that blows something else up. It removes it. Just like the other 2 pillars, removal comes in all shapes and sizes. There's board wipes. Instead of killing just one thing, we're killing everything. They're typically focused on creatures and they get every creature, but you know what? Every rule has an exception. Look at Farewell, we're hitting more than just creatures here. Or you have Vandal Blast, which goes after artifacts. Or you have cards like Single Combat, which will purposely avoid certain creatures. The more typical idea of removal is targeted removal. You have someone that's about to win the game just on the back of one creature, we can arrange for that creature to have a bit of a accident. Black does a great job at just pointing at a creature and saying it's dead. White typically exiles and then leaves something on the board, exiling the thing. So like Banishing Light hits the table, it's still on the table while that thing is exiled. It's decent at removal, but it's like a video game with that glowing red spot on an enemy. If someone just blows Banishing Light up, they get their creature back. Red does direct damage and burn. This can be helpful when it says any target on it, because this could both work as removal, but this could also kill an opponent when it gets to the late game. But I typically avoid direct damage cards. Green sucks at removal except against flyers. There's also Fight in Magic, which is as it sounds, 2 creatures fight each other. That's normally a green thing. Blue has preemptive removal in counter spells, so rather than saying, wow, I really wish you didn't have that creature anymore, you say, I don't think I'm gonna like that creature in 3 turns, I'm just gonna say you can't have it. The last type of removal I'm gonna touch on here is transformative removal. Instead of killing something, we're turning it into something else, something worse. This is almost exclusively done with auras. Lignify is hilarious. Darksteel Mutation is probably the best example of this card, but I'll always have a soft spot for pacifism. It doesn't technically count as transformative, but I think it's transformative enough. You might be asking, why bother with these? Why not just outright kill the creature? My answer is commanders. If you destroy or exile your opponent's commander, they can just recast it. Their answer to your removal is just more mana. This, they have to think outside the box, they have to have the right card in their hand, they have to kill their creature in some way, which then makes Darksteel Mutation that much better, just because now they have to figure something else out besides just killing it because it has indestructible. So card advantage, ramp, removal. If you keep these in mind when you're deck building and you run about 10 of each, you're off to the races. Good luck with your future brews, and don't forget to bolt your birds. And I enjoyed doing this last time, so for the first 24 hours that this video is up, I will be responding to every comment.